Well, let's talk to our next guest, Iain Duncan Smith. He's former Tory leader, also former Work and Pension Secretary, of course, and a Conservative MP. Good morning to you.
Morning, Julia.
Morning. Now, of course, you were a long-standing Brexiteer, long before it became fashionable. We have got, obviously, this statement from the Prime Minister. We've got that interview with Lord Frost yesterday, David Frost, who's been our EU chief negotiator, saying, look, we won't be a client state, we won't blink, and Britain isn't scared of a no deal. Boris Johnson's statement today, 38 days, or we walk away, and no deal will be a good outcome. Is this the usual typical bluffing at the 11th hour? Or does he actually mean it?
Well, I think Boris Johnson certainly means it because that's a reality, that if the EU doesn't engage properly and recognise that this is not the same negotiation that they were having with Theresa May's group that seemed to have no understanding of European law at all and seemed to spend their whole time saying, what would you like to the European Union? So I think there's a slow process of coming to terms with the fact that the UK government is different. That it has the majority to be able to get legislation through, and that this has we've left the EU. I mean, we left back on the 31st of January, so this is an interim period before we finalise a deal. But the reality for the UK is that we are sovereign, and the EU has to deal with a sovereign nation, not a nation that's a member anymore of the European Union, and that seems to be a problem for the EU at the moment with their negotiators.
Well, the Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab said that the EU is operating on double standards, asking the UK to sign up to conditions that it wouldn't expect any other country to sign up to, and indeed would not sign up to itself to get a deal with, say, Canada or Japan when it comes to getting a free trade deal in terms of giving away our rights on how much state aid we give, and indeed handing over control of our fishing waters to other nation states. Do you think the issue is fundamentally that the EU does not really accept Brexit, doesn't really believe it's actually happened, still think that it's going to sort of be undone somehow, and doesn't really accept that we are a third party to deal with now? Or do you think this is just a negotiating tactic? It worked with Theresa May. They still think it might work with Boris Johnson.
Actually, I think the issue isn't that they don't recognise Brexit. They do. They have to, because we've actually left. I mean, this is the bit that people get wrong. We actually left the EU officially, so we are a sovereign country. So they recognise that. They have to. The problem they've got right now is that I think they fear the outcome of Brexit with their UK, which now starts to make changes and does things in a way that puts some pressure on their own market and their own way that they behave. In fact, if you talk to any of those that they've negotiated with, the EU has always been a pretty aggressive, pretty bullying negotiating partner. I was talking to some Japanese officials not so long ago, and they said that they really don't even like the deal that they've got, particularly because they felt they were bullied over the amount of Japanese elements that should be in any single piece of production, which left the EU in a stronger position. So you have to be pretty tough and pretty strong with them. That's what they do. But the reality for them is that their main concern is their fear that the UK becomes a very competitive nation on their borders. And, for example, alignment. They're arguing that we must align with their rules and regulations, which leaves us in their hands. Every time they change their regulations, we would have to change ours, and that's not very sovereign. Fishing, of course, it's a sovereign issue. It's about the fact that we have territorial waters. We're happy to negotiate with them after this about how and how much catch should be taken by different countries. But we're not going to stand by the original agreement because that is dead. And the final bit, of course, is state aids. People say, oh, well, we don't want to have state aids for different companies. The truth is the EU is bound now on a course to include taxation in their state aids rules. And that makes it very difficult for the UK when we wish to alter taxes, change the way that we deal with both individuals and companies, that the EU would have a say in that. And that would be quite wrong as a sovereign nation. So, as Boris Johnson has said, we've asked for a Canada-style deal. The EU has refused to engage on that. But we as a sovereign now, as Canada is compared to the EU, and therefore they need to deal on the reality that's in front of them.
What about the reality of Northern Ireland? We've got the withdrawal agreement signed last year, and this sort of special situation for Northern Ireland made people like the DUP very unhappy, but effectively coming under sort of UK law and EU law in this sort of I mean, it was always going to have to be a muddle because of the status of Northern Ireland on the Irish on the Irish nation, on the island of Ireland, I should say. There is a lot of concern now that a bill that's going to be published this week is actually going to change things, and it's going to formalise trading rules with the UK under the Internal Markets Bill, and effectively it's going to undermine that agreement. Are you concerned about that?
No, I'm not actually, because I think it's quite right for a sovereign country to have put limitations on where its courts can refer to change the rules. So, for example, this bill would essentially lock out the Supreme Court and other courts in the UK from referring to European law or to the judgments of the Court of Justice on a whole range of issues. In other words, they would have to look quite rightly to Parliament for their laws rather than to go to this supranational body. And the second bit about it is people who are saying, oh, this is a shock. I was listening to the BBC the other day, last night actually, talking about this is unexpected. Actually, if they had read the agreement and the bill that we signed as a result, you'll see that in the bill there is a clause, I think it's clause 38, that says specifically in terms that nothing in the agreement shall alter the UK's right for sovereign status. So in other words, anything that we believe is therefore going to change that is already outlawed within that bill. So this future legislation they're talking about bringing forward this week only gives some strength to that. And can I just answer one point that your previous collaborator, who's going to be discussing things with you later today, said this is a difficult financial time for the UK, so this is all going to be double whammies. Actually, the European Union is in a very serious state economically at the moment as well. So this is not a one-way trip. For the EU, they need to have a deal because they export to the UK far more than the UK exports to them in goods and agri-products. The UK is a big exporter of financial services, and that's the biggest part of our GDP by a very long way, and that doesn't carry tariffs.
Back in June 2016, someone has just tweeted me, Boris Johnson said, of course EU countries will continue trading with us on a tariff-free basis. They would be damaging their own commercial interests if they didn't. That's why EU politicians would be banging down the door for a trade deal. On the 24th of June. Well, because they didn't really do that straight away. We went through all the machinations and the pain of the last few years. Are you 100% confident that we will get a deal because it is in the interest of the German car manufacturers and the French agricultural sector, etc., and the Spanish fisheries people, or whatever it is? Are you 100% convinced it's going to happen?
No, I've never been absolutely convinced that common sense prevails. But, there is a problem right now, and that is the negotiators under Monsieur Barnier, they're not the ones that will make the final decision. So, in truth, we won't know any of this until, at last, the governments themselves get engaged. In fact, I see that the European President van der Leyen, who I know very well because she used to be my opposite number in Germany when I was Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, she has already now called on Mrs. Merkel and other key European leaders to now become part of the negotiations. And my view is that this doesn't really begin to take off until they all come together and enter the negotiations. Okay. And they're the ones that set the terms. Okay. And they're the ones whose jobs and livelihoods rely on whether or not they get a deal. So I think that's where they
just finally bringing things back to home. Today is supposed to be the day where we was expecting people to get back to work, get back to the workplace, particularly the civil servants, many people in big companies. We've seen a lot of city centres, absolute ghost towns at the moment, lots of people working from home, lots of people also still furloughed. What do you think about the government stepping up on the policy of basically sort of leading by example, getting more MPs in the chamber, getting civil servants back into their Whitehall offices and the like, and getting this country back to some semblance of normality?
Well, to be fair, the arrangements in the House need to be tightened up, but MPs are back at work and most of their staff are back at work now. And they were back at work in July, frankly. So I think for civil servants to find a reason not to be back at their offices, I think is absurd. So the government could start by saying civil servants now must get back to their desk unless they have a good health reason why they shouldn't be there. Set an example to some of the bigger companies who have shown absolutely no courage whatsoever in getting these things done, because the small and medium businesses in London and in the cities around the country, they rely on this eco-culture of big businesses, people going out for lunch, people buying their sandwiches, their coffees, going to the pub or whatever in the evenings after work. All this sort of stuff is part of what makes Britain tick. And at the end of the day, it is the small and medium companies of the UK that provide the jobs, not the big companies. It's the small companies. And if they are trying to feed off the activity of the big companies, but the big companies aren't playing, that means we're going to have a disastrous point when people will lose their jobs. So I would say to both the big companies, particularly the civil service, come on, get back to your desks unless you have a health problem. It's time to support all of those around you to make sure their livelihoods and their lives aren't destroyed, because we have a fear factor which is unborne out by the outcomes of COVID-19.
Thank you very much indeed. Iain Duncan Smith there.